What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 30 wide receiver rankings for week 7 of the NFL season. Only 2 teams on bye, Bears, Cowboys, so not as bad as the last couple of weeks, but I do think it starts to get a little sketchy once we're getting into our wide receiver threes. If you guys enjoy the video, have any questions, drop them down below, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Let's just dive right into tier 1 here. Gonna have 5 tier 1 wide receivers. It's going to be Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, AJ Brown, Malik Nabers, Amon-Ra St. Brown. I wouldn't get too concerned about the order of these guys. If you have them, you're starting them. For Justin Jefferson here, he's coming off the bye week. The Lions have allowed the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position. Obviously, Jefferson is an elite option at the wide receiver position, and he has the matchup. Jamar Chase averaging over 20 PPR points per game. Not super concerned here about him going up against the Browns. AJ Brown here has played, 2 weeks this season. Week 1, he went 5 for 119 and a touchdown. Then he returned week 6, went 6 for 116 and a touchdown. 2 monster games. He's a high-end wide receiver 1. Malik Nabers has missed the last 2 games with a concussion. You would assume he'd be able to come back here. And if he's playing, he should have the full workload. Not like he's going to be limited or anything. And then the Eagles have allowed the 7th most points per game to the wide receiver position. So coming back to a pretty favorable matchup. And then the final guy in this tier, Amon-Ra St. Brown. The Vikings defense, has been kind of dangerous. They've been rough for some quarterbacks, but they are actually allowing the most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. So I like the matchup here. Now, before I shift into tier 2, I do just want to run through a few injuries of players who I don't think are going to be good to go this week. Unfortunately for Thursday night, the Broncos secondary is pretty banged up, but we have Chris Olave dealing with a concussion. Don't think he's going to be good to go. And then Rashid Shaheed, who is apparently dealing with some sort of serious knee injury, so assume he also wouldn't be able to go. Puka Nacua, not going to come off of IR with his knee injury. And then Devontae Adams, I know there was some discussion about him potentially not getting traded. Maybe he's coming back. Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about that report. I don't know. I feel like he's on this rough offense. The quarterback situation is a mess. They kind of agreed to trade him. I don't know if he's going back on that. So he might still be hurt, if they're not going to trade him here. So I don't think Adams is going to play this week. But looking at tier 2 here, starting off with Chris Godwin going up against the Ravens. Chris Godwin's been a monster start off the season, averaging 20.7 PPR points per game. Also a pretty solid matchup here. The Ravens are allowing the 3rd most points per game to the wide receiver position. Then I have Stephon Diggs going up against the Packers. In the first game without Nico Collins, he went 6 for 77 and a touchdown. He's just been a super reliable option week to week, and I think operating as the wide receiver 1, he definitely deserves to be in here as a locked-in mid-tier wide receiver 1 play. Then I have Cooper Kupp. There's no guarantee he plays this week going up against the Raiders, but he could potentially return from that ankle injury. If he's good to go, you're obviously playing him. If we find out later in the week he's out, then I'll adjust when I update these rankings later on. And then we're getting into the Whittingtons, the Demarcus Robinsons, players like that. After Kupp, going with Jaden Reed here, he's averaging 22.2 points per game with Jordan Love at quarterback. I think he's established himself here as a fantasy wide receiver 1. Then I have Deontay Johnson going up against the Commanders. It's a solid matchup here. They've allowed the 5th most points per game to the wide receiver position. And with Andy Dalton at quarterback, Deontay Johnson is averaging 18.3 points per game. So nice matchup, and Deontay continues to ball. Really only 1 down game in the 4 that they've played together. Then I have Drake London going up against the Seahawks. He has put up 17 plus PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. He had the one dud week in week 1, but since then, it's been a super impressive run here for Drake London. Then I'm going with Terry McLaurin, another dude who's been cruising here. 18.7 points per game in his last 4. The Commanders are number 1 in implied points this week, going up against the Panthers. So they're going to be scoring. Terry's, putting together some big plays. He's getting into the end zone. I think he's a wide receiver 1. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Garrett Wilson. Kind of a slow start to the season. The chemistry with Rodgers didn't really seem to be there. Definitely seems like it's progressing at this point. He has back-to-back games with 100-plus receiving yards, a touchdown in each of those. The volume is there. I guess the issue here in this matchup is that they are tied for the fewest implied points. So Vegas does not think they're going to put up points against the Steelers defense. I still think he's playable based on the volume. I think this offense is putting some things together here. So I do think he's a solid play this week. You're just kind of hoping that Devontae Adams does not enter the building. And then looking at tier 3 here, Going to start it off with two wide receiver twos behind tier one wide receiver ones. We have T. Higgins, Devonta Smith. T. Higgins has actually out-targeted Jamar Chase in the last 3 weeks. So something interesting there. He's commanding volume. He's been a solid option since returning from injury. And then for Devonta Smith here, he's put up 14 plus PPR points in all 4 of his games. So very high weekly floor. He's been a very consistent option this season. Then I'm going with Mike Evans going up against the Ravens. Chris Godwin's just kind of blowing him out of the water early on in the season. Like I talked about with Godwin, this is a solid matchup. 3rd most points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. But Mike Evans has just been super boomer bust. He's played 6 games this season. In 3 of those games, he has put up 23 plus points. In the other 3, he has scored under 8. So he could go out there, be a high-end wide receiver 1, or he just could completely flop in your lineup. Chris Godwin just seems to have a much higher weekly floor while also carrying that ceiling. So I still think Evans is a solid play, but I think at some point we do have to kind of react to that volatility. Then I'm going with Brian Thomas Jr., coming off the worst fantasy game of the season. It could have been fine. He had a really bad touchdown drop in that early Sunday game. I'm still a believer in him. It is possible he draws the Christian Gonzalez matchup, which could be tough, but I believe in the talent. I think he's going to bounce back. He's a rookie. He's only going to get better moving forward. Then I have Jameson Williams, who I'm pretty high on this week. This is just a great matchup here. The Vikings have allowed the most points per game to the wide receiver position. JMO has put up 14 plus points in 4 out of 5 of his games. The only concern I have here is that the volume has kind of fallen off. Week 1, week 2, I want to say he combined for like 20 total targets. Over the last 3 games, he only has 9 total targets, which is a little bit sketchy because the floor is pretty low, but he just consistently is ripping off these big plays. You know, he's getting long touchdowns, so the volume doesn't really need to be there if he can consistently do it. I think the matchup kind of, makes me more excited here, where even if the volume's not there, I still think he has the upside to rip off a big play. And then the final guy in this tier, DK Metcalf. Might seem weird to have Metcalf this low, especially, below a guy like JMO who doesn't have that consistent volume. But DK Metcalf has been extremely boomer bust this year. 3 games with 15 plus points, 3 games under 8. I thought this might have been the time where he bounces back into that wide receiver 1 territory. And not saying it can't happen, but I do think we need to readjust. I think a couple back-to-back bad weeks here. And we just look at the last, I want to say 3 seasons, 2-3 seasons. He's kind of just settled in this mid-tier, back-end wide receiver 2 range. So that's kind of where I have him this week. And they're looking at tier 4. Going to start it off with Tank Dell. I really like Tank Dell heading into the season. It was a rough start, but he had a really solid game without Nico Collins. 7 for 57 and a touchdown. I think he can continue, putting up solid stat lines with Nico Collins out. Then I have Deebo Samuel going up against the Chiefs. Coming off a nice week 6, 3 for 102 and a touchdown. The issue is the lack of volume. He's only been targeted 13 times in the last 3 games. It's always tough to predict which 49ers weapon is going to have the big play, have the big game. It could be Kittle. It's been Kittle a lot early on in the season. It could be Ayuk. When CMC's back, it's going to get even more complicated. So right now, I have Deebo as a back-end wide receiver 2. Then I have Zay Flowers going up against the Buccaneers here. He had the 2 really low volume games where he was commanding 2 and 4 targets. But in the other 4 games, he's been 9 plus targets. I think he's definitely game script dependent, where you want the game script to be competitive or have them trailing. If they go ahead, they're just going to pivot away entirely from the pass. But I do think this could be a pretty competitive game here against the Bucs. This Bucs offense can put up points, put some pressure on the Ravens defense. So Zay Flowers, nice wide receiver 2 play. Then I have Marvin Harrison Jr. We're not sure if he's going to be able to go, dealing with a concussion, left the week 6 game. If he's playing, I think he's in that back end wide receiver 2 area. If he doesn't play, probably just fading that wide receiver room. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Tyreek Hill going up against the Colts. And he's been rough this season. 8.7 PPR points per game in his last 4. That's not getting it done. He had the huge week 1. Since then, it's been pretty much nothing. We're not getting Tua back this week. He's got 1 more week, mandatory on the IR. I think maybe we can get a little something coming off the bye week. This offense should look a little bit better. Tyreek Hill is obviously super talented, but the quarterback concern is still there for this Dolphins team. And then tier 5, the final tier, I feel like this is where it starts to get a little bit sketchy, especially towards the end of this tier. Going to start it off with Jordan Addison going up against the Lions. The Lions have allowed the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position. Coming off the bye week here for the Vikings, Sam Darnold's looked good. I think he can definitely support Addison here as a wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 for me for fantasy. And then Darnell Mooney going up against the Seahawks, coming off a down game, but on the season, he's still the wide receiver 27 in points per game. He's been a nice option. I still think he belongs here as like a high-end wide receiver 3. Then I have Juju Smith-Schuster going up against the Niners. I don't quite know what to make out of this Juju thing here. I talked about him in my waiver wire video. He goes out week 5, 7 for 130 with Rashee Rice. It seems like he's kind of stepping into that wide receiver 1 role. I just don't know if it's going to stick. And here's, I guess, where the situation is so odd. Juju Smith-Schuster was cut by the Patriots before the season, the team with the worst wide receiver room in the NFL. They deemed that Juju Smith was not good enough to be in that, roster. He was not good enough to play. He wasn't even good enough to start for them, was not even good enough to be on their bench. And then he's going to go to the Chiefs and now be their wide receiver 1. The situation is odd, so we'll see if it was like a one-game fluke situation. I do think Xavier Worthy is going to get more involved. I think he's going to get better and better. But at this point, I feel like Juju's probably the top play, and I guess we'll see how he does here in his second week without Rashee Rice. Then I have Brandon Ayuk going up against the Chiefs. Like, at some point, we have to dock Brandon Ayuk for just being brutal to start off the season. You can give him the pass early on, some target competition, was holding out. But he has been below 10 PPR points in 5 out of 6 games. That's just not good enough. I don't think you can consider him any more than like a wide receiver 3 right now. Then I have JSN, not a super fun play, not a super high upside option. He's the wide receiver 36 in points per game. Should have a decent floor, but not an overly exciting option. And then the final guy here, I wish I could rank him higher. It's going to be Josh Downs going up against the Dolphins. In his last 3 games, keep in mind it's with Flacco at quarterback, 8 for 82 and a touchdown, 9 for 69, and then 7 for 66 and a touchdown. He looks like the wide receiver 1 on this team. He is outproducing Michael Pittman. And if Flacco was at quarterback, I might be getting reckless with my Josh Downs ranking. He'd probably be somewhere in that tier 3 area. Unfortunately, for Josh Downs, it seems like Anthony Richardson is probably going to be back this week. And I do think it's just a massive drop-off. You look at the early season production of a guy like Michael Pittman, he wasn't doing anything with Richardson at quarterback. I'm not saying Downs is going to be completely unplayable. I'm not saying Pittman's going to be completely unplayable. But from what we've seen, these guys kind of have been with Richardson at quarterback. So hopefully the talent, kind of prevails. Maybe Josh Downs unlocks Richardson, his underneath passing. We'll see. I do wish I could put him higher, but that's why he might be lower than you were expecting. But that's going to wrap it up for my top 30 wide receiver rankings. Like I said at the top, I'll update these later on in the week. But thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.